Ever wondered why some comics steadily increase in value while others crash? Today we're diving into comic book demand. I'll break down what drives these trends and how you can stay ahead of the game, sharing what beginners don't know but pros take for granted. Let's get into it. There's a lot of comics out there, over 140,000 separate issues according to the Library of Congress. The vast majority aren't exactly what you'd call valuable. Some are barely worth the decomposing paper they're printed on. But then you've got comics that are so desirable, people are willing to max out their credit cards, which I don't recommend. So why is that? What creates demand? For many of us, it comes down to nostalgia. There's something magical that taps into our memories. I remember my mom putting a Captain America Mego figure in my 5th birthday cake. I'd fall asleep under a Spider-Man bedspread, and I'd wake up early on Saturday morning to watch Super Friends or Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. These superheroes were as much a part of my childhood as my family. I know I'm not the only one who had fond memories. Now, when it comes to demand of specific comic books, one of the biggest factors is the first appearance of major characters. In fact, these first appearances make up the bulk of the most valuable comics in the market. Sometimes a first appearance is clear-cut. Here's Cap's first appearance. He's on the cover, striking a certain mustachioed villain. Oh yeah, the book is called Captain America Comics #1. All signals point to this historic first appearance. Consequently, it's by far the most in-demand and valuable Captain America comic book. But sometimes the first appearance isn't as obvious. Wonder Woman's first appearance is in All-Star Comics #8, but you have to open up the book to see her image. This is an example of a muted first appearance. All-Star 8 is still the most valuable single issue of Wonder Woman, but only slightly more valuable than her first cover appearance, which is in Sensation Comics #1, and Wonder Woman #1, the first issue of her own title. On that point, first issues are often high demand, even when they don't offer a major first appearance. Superman 1, Detective Comics #1, Amazing Spider-Man #1 all set the tone for legendary series. Another major driver of demand? Cover art. Classic covers can send a comic's value skyrocketing. Some comics known for little more than their iconic cover art have sold for 6 figures. Then when you combine a superhero we love with a killer cover, like Detective Comics 31 or Superman 14, demand goes through the roof. If you want to dive deeper into the world of comic book demand, I suggest you check out the Overstreet Price Guide, especially this one, the 20th edition from 1990. Bob Overstreet himself wrote a fantastic market report. In fact, he and his colleagues came up with 12 criteria to evaluate a comic's importance, which is closely tied to its demand. He listed hundreds of the most important books from 1933 to 1943, and then assigned ratings to this exclusive list to further differentiate them, 0 to 6 stars based on these criteria. For context, Adventure 40, the first conceived story and full cover appearance of Sandman, received 2 stars. More Fun 52, the first appearance of the Spectre, was among the 3-star books. All-American Comics 16 and Batman 1 received 4 stars. Marvel 1 and Tech 27 received the rare 5-star designation, among a few others. While not listed because they were published later, I'm assuming that Overstreet and his colleagues would have given 5 stars to Amazing Fantasy 15, Fantastic Four 1, and Showcase 4 using the same criteria. Out of all thousands of issues, only one comic book received 6 stars. Can you guess what it is? It's Action Comics #1, of course, the first appearance of Superman. Supes, as you know, is one of the most durable and popular characters in comic history. The famous issue didn't just introduce the Man of Steel, it introduced the entire superhero genre. That's history right there. Overstreet acknowledged that the list and the star system are not perfect. He also knew that over time that perceptions can change, which brings us to the next chapter. Demand is, well, fickle. A few months ago, I took a look at a facsimile of the very first Overstreet Price Guide from 1970. Only 38 comic books were listed as being worth $100 or more in near mint condition. And the most expensive book in the guide? Merely $300. Now compare that to today, where there are likely over 100 separate issues that surpass $100,000 in near mint condition. And even some cracking the $1 million mark. The demand for comics has exploded. But it hasn't been a smooth straight line to the top. In fact, there's been a lot of fluctuation. And not all comic books have benefited to the same degree. I remember the first big pullback in the mid-1990s. Right before then, buying comics, even new ones, had become synonymous with investing. Speculators were gobbling up dozens of copies of the same issue, betting on a future windfall. And let's not forget those crazy gimmicks that publishers were throwing out. The foil covers, the holograms, to fuel the speculative frenzy. But, as you might have guessed, the bubble burst. Sadly, comic book stores shuttered by the hundreds, and collectors were left holding long boxes full of comics that weren't worth the paper they were printed on. Fast forward to today. And we're seeing another pullback. This one started around 2022 and has been playing out for about 2 years now. Like the 1990s pullback, it was preceded by a bubble, this time fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic. With the world locked down and people looking for ways to spend their newfound time and stimulus checks, comic demand went through the roof. But as with all bubbles, gravity kicked in. The market has cooled down considerably. Though, as in the past, the rare Golden Age comics are, relatively speaking, weathering the storm better. Nevertheless, even they are starting to show signs of weakness. It's a reminder that comic book demand can be volatile and that no comic book is bulletproof. But here's the good news. Despite these pullbacks, the overall trend for comic books across the decades has been positive. The demand for comic books, particularly the vintage ones, has been on the rise for years. Yes, there are setbacks and dips, but if you're in it for the long game, I believe that demand will grow, especially for the rare, iconic issues. Let's zoom way out and make a comparison between the 1970 Overstreet price guide and today. Back then, surprise, surprise, the most expensive comic books were Action Comics #1 and Detective Comics #27. In near mint condition, they were listed as $300 and $275 respectively. Not a bad deal. Even then, superheroes were king. Those two comics have always held top spots in the market. On the flip side, some characters that were incredibly popular, like Tarzan, Popeye, and Prince Valiant, have lost their prominence over time. They faded from the top tier list of comic collectors, and it's due to shifts in demand. Speaking of which, sometimes entire genres fall out of favor. Back in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s, Western comics were in demand. Characters like the Lone Ranger and Gene Autry were the stuff of legends. Unfortunately, the appeal of Westerns stopped with the baby boomer generation. Sometimes it works the other way around. An obscure genre can rise to prominence. Take romance comics, for example. These books, which used to populate dollar bins, have exploded in value in recent years. Some are fetching hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of dollars. Much of this is thanks to collectors discovering their charm and brilliant artwork. Then we have an effect that many of you all know, and that's the movie effect. In the 2000s, Hollywood's constant stream of superhero blockbusters set the speculation world on fire. Movie announcement can skyrocket the demand for a specific issue. When a movie is well received, the comic books related to that film can see sustained increases in value. See what happened to Avengers #1. Hit after hit after hit, and with each hit, the value of the book kept going up. But as we've seen with the Eternals, it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes a particular group can come to a movie, it's a flop, the value goes up until the movie comes out, then boom, it drops down and it may never come back. Something that I want everybody to know, however, is that even the movies that were huge and popular and had several hits like Avengers 1, you're talking about Iron Man, they too have not been immune to the post-bubble crash. The difference between them and, say, Eternals #1 is that their drop has been much less in terms of percentage. Let's turn our focus to 6 nuanced factors that can influence demand and ultimately the value of a comic book. By the way, other factors affect desirability that I don't talk about in this video, like pedigrees and restoration, but you can find information about those topics and more, including an article I wrote about desirability, in the description box below. Let's get back to the nuanced factors. Most collectors know that the issue and the grade of a comic, like Hulk 181 in an 8.0 grade, are the foundation for determining value. In fact, most of the time, those two factors account for the lion's share. But there's more going on behind the scenes, which can make the difference between you making or losing money on a comic deal. In other words, 2 copies of the same book in the same grade can attract different levels of demand. And that's where the nuance comes in. Let's break it down. Factor 1, different defects affect eye appeal differently, especially in low grade. Let's start with an example. Here we have 2 copies of Superman #1. Now these 2 books are technically the same grade, a 0.5. But, spoiler alert, one is definitely more desirable than the other. The sharp looking copy is missing a back cover, so it definitely deserves a 0.5. Even still, for me and most collectors, the front cover carries the day and I'd pay a premium for that 0.5 copy. One of the first things that advanced collectors will look at is factor 2, and that's page quality, which can vary wildly. You might have a comic with pure white pages that looks and feels like it came right off the newsstand. And then you might have a comic the pages are so brittle that they are literally turning to dust. The role of page quality on demand depends on the age of the comic. For newer books, Bronze Age and forward, many collectors expect for them to have white pages. And in fact, some of them won't buy any comics from that era that have anything less than white. For Silver and Golden Age books, it's hard to be that strict because there are fewer of these books in general, and the page quality tends to be poor. So many people, including myself, are fine with cream to off-white pages. But when you do find a Silver or Golden Age book that has pure white pages, watch out. Demand goes higher and you can expect to pay more for those books. On the flip side, if you're dealing with books with brittle pages, regardless of age, you can expect that value is going to go down. Now, CGC itself tops out the grade at 3.5 for any book with brittle pages. But even still, people often won't pay the typical Blue Label 3.5 money for a 3.5 with brittle pages. Many collectors avoid brittle pages altogether, and they don't have a single copy in their collection with brittle or even slightly brittle pages. In fairness, there are some books that are so rare and that they have such a high percentage that are brittle that if you want a copy, you're going to have to hold your nose and probably get one with those brittle pages. An example is Detective Comics #1, the classic issue from 1937. There aren't that many out there, 16 that are Blue Label, 35 overall, and a very high percentage are brittle or slightly brittle. I've got a health-related question for you. Is your tetanus shot up to date? Because factor number 3 is rusty staples. Most comics don't have any rust, which is great. But there's a fair percentage of older books that do. Rust can show up in a variety of forms, from barely noticeable spots to full-blown corrosion that is spread from the staples to the paper itself. And here's the thing, rust can be a deal breaker for collectors, especially if the rust has migrated into the paper. Not only can it be an eyesore, but it also may strike concern that the rust will continue to migrate. Now here's one that's specific to Marvel books from the 1960s. Factor 4 is Marvel chipping, a manufacturing defect that occurred often in that period, a dull cutting blade resulting in a chipped appearance, most often on the right side of the cover. This defect can significantly reduce the desirability of a book. Collectors prefer copies with little or no Marvel chipping. And if you find a copy of Amazing Fantasy #15 without this flaw, well, you've got yourself a special book. Speaking of Marvel keys, let's talk about the 5th factor, vibrancy. Ever notice that some comics just pop with color, while others are bland? Well, that's likely due to 2 reasons. Some early print runs, especially in the Golden and Silver Age, suffered from poor quality control and inconsistent printing. Unfortunately, this led to many copies having duller colors. Second, some comic collectors kept their comics exposed to light, which eventually faded the colors. If you're hunting for a comic with a cover that has vibrant, bold colors, that book is likely to command a higher price. Finally, we have factor 6, centeredness. No, I'm not talking about self-centeredness like a particular book has an ego. Instead, I'm referring to how well the cover design is aligned. Basically, how balanced it looks. This might sound like a small thing, but believe me, collectors can be very particular about it. Was the comic cut evenly when it was manufactured? Does the cover image appear too high, too low, or even crooked? For some comics, this can be a big deal. Take Tales of Suspense #39, the first appearance of Iron Man. A lot of collectors want to see that full, crisp double quotation mark at the end of Iron Man. Is that part of the art cut off? Well, it's going to hurt the comic's value, even if the grade is otherwise high. I'm guessing that many of you sharp collectors have been thinking, demand is only half the value equation. Keston, how about supply? You're in luck. This video, the most comprehensive on YouTube, breaks down the 5 types of rarity that every collector should know. So if you want a fuller understanding of value, what are you waiting for? Thanks so much for watching, my friends, and I hope to see you around real soon.